I started going into questions. Where are you at? Tell me where you are. What's going on? Where were you shot? Then he stops for a minute, and then he says, I love you and the kids and to take care of the kids. He stopped responding.
Because of the trauma from the gunshot, most likely his lungs were filling with blood. The body's trying very hard, it's working overdrive. The lawyer reached out to the police and volunteered his client.
He can tell them exactly who committed the crime.
He was actually a primary target, the guy they really would like to have shot. The bad guys, they don't care. It's revenge, retaliation, revenge, retaliation.
October 19th, 2012, Syracuse, New York. It's just after 8 p.m. on the city's north side.
The Syracuse Police Department received 3 911 calls for a shooting.
Officers rush to the location where they find 2 victims.
They found one victim on the ground, and then they also found another person that had a minor, very minor injury from a gunshot wound that grazed his back, his upper back.
The man on the ground is struggling to breathe. Officers attempt first aid.
They didn't see obvious injury to him at that point. So what they did is they cut his shirt off, and then they spotted a small amount of blood. He was shot once in the left side near his armpit. Because of the trauma from the gunshot, most likely his lungs were filling with blood. The body's trying very hard, it's working overdrive to get air in. Just a minute or two after that, our ambulance crew arrived and was able to provide advanced medical care.
EMTs rush the man to the hospital. The second victim identifies himself as 20-year-old Shavoki Bloodworth.
He was looked at by ambulance personnel on the scene and declined further treatment.
Shavoki tells police he doesn't know the other victim. At the hospital, the man fighting for his life is soon identified as 30-year-old Walter Bell, a resident of South Carolina. Walter Bell III was born on July 12, 1982, in Orangeburg, South Carolina. At a young age, Walter's parents separated, and he went to live with his mother in New York.
Walter was born in South Carolina, but spent most of his childhood and growing up in Long Island.
There, Walter was part of a large community of family and friends that included 2 brothers, 4 younger sisters, and his childhood best friend, Latia.
Everybody was just carefree, just running around having a good time, causing destruction with the parents, you know, running the parents crazy.
Walter took care of his siblings.
Walter was the protector. He felt like he had to protect his sisters. The sisters got boyfriends, and he had to interrogate them.
He's just like so family oriented. He cares about people, and he put others before himself.
In his teenage years, Walter's mom grew concerned that her son was headed down the wrong path.
Walter started getting into a little bit of the rougher lifestyle of Long Island, so his mom decided to send him back to South Carolina to live with his dad.
Orangeburg, South Carolina was a big change. But not too long after he moved, Walter welcomed a familiar face to town.
My family was gradually moving to South Carolina because there was land owned within the family. And so when we moved, I boo-hoo cried from New York to Virginia. And I was kind of relieved when I got closer to South Carolina because that phone rang and it was Walter calling me.
In South Carolina, Walter and Latia's lifelong friendship blossomed into a full-blown romance.
Walter was always there for her. She was always there for him. He was gonna marry Tia.
Walter's home life was rocky. During their senior year of high school, Walter and Latia came to depend on each other like they never had before.
He had nowhere to stay, I had nowhere to stay due to, family issues. And we walked and walked and walked throughout the nights. We went up into a football field and slept in the announcer's box for weeks.
So it was like him and Tia was pretty much just living on the street.
The young lovers were on their own. Walter's sister-in-law tried to help.
Santana would sneak food and covers and blankets and pillows and things out of the window for us at night. And nobody knew we was outside that window but her.
In 2003, more trouble caught up with Walter.
Walter got into some things that he should not have. He was accused of breaking into homes and stealing things.
21-year-old Walter was arrested and charged with second-degree burglary. He pled guilty and was sentenced to 15 years in prison.
I cried and I cried and I cried. And we were allowed to spend some time together afterwards, back by the holding cells. And Walter looked at me and said, the only thing I want you to do is live your life to whatever makes you happy. Just make sure that when I come home, I have a place to come home to.
When he was in prison, it was never a time that he didn't write, he didn't call, he always kept in contact, always.
There was a lot of ups and downs, a lot of me trying to find myself, a lot of me trying to rebuild myself back up.
In October 2010, after almost 7 years behind bars, Walter was granted parole. By then, Latia was a single mother to 3 young kids. Walter and Latia picked up where they left off.
When he came home, he loved her kids. He took all of her kids in, they was his kids.
When he started bonding with the kids is when it was just okay, well, it is what it is, we can't change it.
The childhood sweethearts settled into life together, with Walter taking on the role of stepdad. By the summer of 2012, they had plans to marry. But first, they needed a fresh start.
He was unable to find work because of his record. He was just trying and just staying focused and not going back on the prior ways that he was doing, the things he was doing before he went to jail. He was trying to make a way and work, actually work.
And then Walter hears about an opportunity back in New York.
Walter's cousin offered to help him get a job at a recycling center in Syracuse.
I said, well, I don't know. I really don't want to go back to New York. And he looked me in my eyes and he said, Tia, I ride with you no matter what. Whatever decisions you make, I ride with you on it. I want you to ride with me on this. That Friday, we packed up 3 laundry bags of clothes and shoes, packed the kids up, and got on the Greyhound.
The couple stayed with friends and in hotels until they could find a place of their own. Around the same time, Latia delivered news that there was more change to come.
I said, Walter, and I showed him the pregnancy test. He was like, are you serious? He was so happy. Within 5 minutes, he had done called his mom. He had done called his oldest sister. He called his god sister. He was just so happy.
He was so excited that he was about to be a dad. Nobody couldn't take that moment from him. That moment meant the world.
Just 6 weeks after arriving in Syracuse, Walter Bell is fighting for his life at a hospital following a life-threatening gunshot wound. Another man, Shavoki Bloodworth, was grazed by a bullet in the same attack. He is still on the scene.
He voluntarily gave part of his story as to what happened, as to how he saw the incident unfold.
Which isn't much.
Mr. Bloodworth was saying he didn't know the man, Mr. Bell in this case, and that he was just an innocent bystander, didn't know anything, just heard some gunshots and felt something hit his back.
Investigators search for evidence. They recover 2 .25 caliber shell casings.
The other thing you want to immediately do is start to canvass the area, especially for cameras. And then you want to find anybody that's close by that may have observed what happened. One of the people that called 911, her and her daughter got a good look at 2 males that walked past their house.
They described them as wearing dark clothing.
They saw 2 black men in their 20s approach the victim. A few minutes later, shots rung out.
And then they saw them go past back by their house, go back to a vehicle they described as a white SUV that then left the scene. They didn't see them with a gun. They didn't see them actually shoot anybody. They just saw them going to the crime scene and then leaving the crime scene.
Police put out an APB with the descriptions. Then, less than an hour after the initial 911 calls, detectives get an update on Walter's condition.
His bleeding was internal, so there wasn't much that they could do. Walter was pronounced dead at the Upstate University Hospital.
Now they have a homicide investigation on their hands.
In the late hours of October 19, 2012, police in Syracuse, New York, are investigating a shooting when they learn that one of the victims, 30-year-old Walter Bell, did not survive. Detectives go to the hospital where doctors have recovered the bullet from Walter's body.
It was a small .25 caliber, consistent with the 2 shell casings that were found up the street.
Hospital staff tell detectives that the victim's fiancée, Latia Walker, is on the phone. She has just been informed of the shooting.
The detective asked me what my name was, where did I live, how soon could I get to the hospital. And I said to him, I don't even know where, I don't know where anything is. I've only been in town for 6 weeks. I would have to figure out how I'm getting there. And I told him I had my kids.
Detectives agreed to meet Latia at the hotel where she and Walter have been staying since arriving in town.
They showed up, they knocked on the door, and one of them asked me to step outside with him. The other one stayed inside with the kids. And he told me that Walter didn't make it. At that point, I lost all hope for everything, everything.
Latia explains that earlier in the evening, she and Walter had been at the hotel when he received a phone call.
It was his cousin calling and saying, he wanted to spend some time with him and things of that nature. So Walter decided to go with him. Walter left the motel probably around 4:30, 5 o'clock. Anytime Walter goes anywhere, when he gets to where he's going, he always called me to let me know he made it to where he was going okay. So I called Walter about 6:45, 7 o'clock. He's like, yeah, I'm all right. I just, I lost track of time. I forgot to call you, my bad. And he's like, but I'm gonna call you before I come home because I wanna know what you need from the store. So I said, okay. Around 7:55, he called me. Automatically, I'm thinking he's in the grocery store. Let me tell him what I want. So I'm like, yeah, I want some strawberries and I want some bananas and make sure you get some cereal for the kids for in the morning. And he's like, Tia, stop. I said, well, what? Tia, I've been shot. He sounded okay, and I thought he was playing with me.
For about a whole minute of that phone call, she believes he's joking.
He says, no, I've really been shot. And then he's paused. His whole demeanor, everything changed. He paused, and now I'm taking him seriously because now I could tell something is wrong. And And so I started going into questions. Where are you at? Tell me where you are. What's going on? Where were you shot? You know, I'm asking 1,000,001 questions, and the only thing he's saying is that he couldn't breathe. You know, I can't breathe. Oh my God, I can't breathe. I can't breathe. Then he stops for a minute, and then he says, I love you and the kids, and to take care of the kids. He stopped responding. We've always had the relationship of getting to one another when we needed to. And I couldn't get to him. I didn't know where he was.
Desperate and unsure what to do, Latia started calling local hospitals.
The only thing that could go through my head was, what am I gonna do now? Well, I'm here by myself. I got my kids. How am I gonna tell these kids?
Police ask Latia if she knows anyone who might have been after Walter.
They want to know exactly what could have caused this homicide, if he had any enemies or any known people in the area that would want to harm him. Latia makes them aware that they had literally just moved.
He had just really come here from South Carolina with his family, and then before that was from Long Island.
The only information Latia has is that Walter had been with his cousin in the hours before he died.
I thought he had gotten into it with somebody. That's the only, explanation that I could have come up with.
She gives the address where Walter's cousin lives, just a block away. Investigators hope that he can shed light on what went down in Walter's final hours.
At this point, detectives have more questions than answers.
It's really about talking to people.
Just hours after the fatal shooting of Walter Bell, Syracuse detectives head to the residence where Walter's cousin lives with friends. Police learn they had welcomed Walter when he arrived in Syracuse.
Mr. Bell had lived with them when he first moved up from South Carolina. They were very cooperative.
The group tells police that Walter was still learning the nuances of street politics on the North Side. In fact, they said Walter made a near-fatal blunder a couple days before by walking on Catherine Street, the same street where he ultimately lost his life.
They told us that he had been shot at just a couple days before that, less than half a block from the incident. And his friends that they lived with on Lodi Street, which is right around the corner, warned him and kept telling him, hey, you shouldn't hang out over there.
Investigators consider whether Walter was unknowingly caught up in a neighborhood feud.
Mr. Bell may not have been a direct target.
They don't know if the target was Walter Bell or if it was Shavoki Bloodworth.
Detectives ask the group what they know about the other shooting victim. They say that despite what he told police at the scene, Walter and Shavoki did know each other.
Mr. Bloodworth and Mr. Bell were known as friends. They would often hang out together.
Investigators question why he would hold back.
Now, investigators want to talk to Shavoki Bloodworth to see exactly what he knows.
Before they do, one of Walter's friends offers information about a man he says is at the center of the neighborhood feud.
We heard the name of Mr. Acevedo from the friends of Mr. Bell. All he knew by his nickname, so he accompanied the police in an unmarked vehicle and pointed out the house that it turns out to be Mr. Acevedo's house.
Unfortunately, he isn't home. Investigators shift their focus back to Shavoki Bloodworth and conduct a background search.
Mr. Bloodworth had been involved in the criminal justice system. He had been arrested for dealing drugs. There was some robbery, type street robbery thing. There was probably a dispute that turned bad. So he had been around, he had been in the game, as we'll say.
In the early morning hours of October 20th, Shavoki Bloodworth agrees to come to the station for another interview. At first, Shavoki maintains his story, saying he didn't know Walter Bell or anything about the shooters.
The detective, as he was talking to him, and this is over a course of a few hours, finally told him, he said, listen, the guy that you were standing there next to, he did pass away. And Mr. Bloodworth actually became emotional over this and broke down in tears. Mr. Bloodworth told the detective that, he goes, okay, he is a friend of mine. I see him every day. And he actually even said that he felt he was a father figure to him. So then he gave a little bit more information.
Shavoki admits he has been involved in the feud and fears that he was the intended target of the shooting, not Walter.
But that's oftentimes how it works. The bad guys, they don't care. They'll take collateral damage. And oftentimes it's revenge, retaliation, revenge, retaliation.
Shavoki still says he didn't see who fired the shots, but thinks there could be a clue in Walter's dying words.
Mr. Bloodworth even tells the detective that our victim, Mr. Bell, says, look out for streets, as he's dying.
Detectives recognize the nickname.
Lundy was on parole and had just gotten out of state prison.
26-year-old Drawn is often spotted around town with his brother, 21-year-old Quincy.
Quincy and Lundy were known to the police. They had been involved in the criminal justice system, being arrested on numerous different occasions for a variety of crimes.
That sets off a bunch of bells in the detective's head, because those brothers have a long rap sheet in the area.
Within hours of the fatal shooting of Walter Bell, investigators have the names of two men who may have been involved.
Lundy actually had just gotten out of prison. Quincy, who's the younger brother, also has multiple arrests in the area for misdemeanors and felonies, and was also shot himself back in 2009.
Before they reach out to the brothers, investigators attempt to track down the man Walter's friends said was at the center of a neighborhood feud, 20-year-old Jason Acevedo.
Mr. Acevedo was attempted to be located a few different times. Once they finally locate him, he was very uncooperative and denied knowing anything.
Detectives refuse to give up. They continue to press Acevedo for information.
It's almost a lost art, is that one-on-one communication and trying to win over people, get them to give you information. Really is an art form. And those are the detectives that are the better detectives are people that know how to do that and actually can spend that time necessary to build a relationship.
Eventually, Jason admits to a feud between himself and the Lundy brothers.
He actually gives some of the story, the backstory too, of him being involved in physical altercations with Quincy Lundy, of actual physical fights that occur in the street in the weeks leading up to the death of Mr. Bell.
Following the interview, investigators begin piecing together the puzzle. In the months prior, the Lundy family had filed a police report.
The Lundy's parents called in that their house was shot up. The police respond, police do a report, they look for shell casings, do what they can to investigate the crime.
No one was charged. But now, investigators consider whether Jason Acevedo was responsible.
He described the fight that he had with Mr. Lundy. He kind of got the worst of it. So that probably is what led to the shootings up of the homes of the Lundy brothers.
The belief that Acevedo was responsible left the Lundy brothers thirsty for revenge.
Their house was shot up in the months leading up to Mr. Bell's death. So they were probably going to exact revenge.
Investigators are still unsure how Walter and Shavoki got caught in the crossfire. They return to the eyewitnesses who described seeing two men flee from the scene of Walter's shooting. Investigators present them with a photo array containing mugshots of Drawn and Quincy Lundy.
They have a really good witness who identifies them, which is pretty powerful because she doesn't know them, was able to quickly point them out of a photo array. Not enough to arrest them, but then everything kept coming back to them.
Detectives reach out to the brothers, who agree to come in for a statement.
Both Lundy brothers voluntarily came in. They didn't arrive together, as I recall, but they were interviewed the same day. They didn't admit to doing this crime, but they admitted that Quincy Lundy was involved in fights with other people that hang out in that area, including Mr. Acevedo.
Quincy says he was not there. He was at home with his mom watching television. Drawn says he's nowhere near Catherine Street during the shooting. He wasn't even on the north side. And that was something that could be easily verified at that time because he had on an ankle bracelet.
Drawn was released from New York State Prison 11 months earlier with a GPS tracking device as a condition of his probation.
The detectives spoke with parole officials. They had said that Mr. Lundy was nowhere near Catherine Street at the time of this incident.
Now they have an eyewitness on scene saying that it was the Lundy brothers, which is a complete contradiction from what they found out from the ankle monitor.
Investigators consider an alternative theory.
They're looking as, okay, so maybe Drawn wasn't there. Was Quincy there with someone else, right?
But Quincy's mom backs up his alibi, stating her son was with her on the night Walter was killed.
Now, mom, sometimes, they could be looking out for their kid, right? So we'll take that with a grain of salt, but the mom seemed earnest enough when she was interviewed and pretty certain. So the detectives were kind of back to square one.
The investigation stalls. Walter's loved ones are left in the lurch. Grieving, pregnant, and alone, Latia lives in fear.
Everybody's worried about me now because I'm in a place where I don't know anyone. I don't have any support. I left Syracuse within 24 hours of Walter passing. And I moved back to Long Island. I stopped speaking to detectives. Reason being, I started getting calls on my personal phone, and it would be people portraying to be detectives. And so now I didn't trust anyone. And I still didn't quite know the story of what happened, so I'm scared. I don't trust anyone, and I felt like they were trying to figure out where I had moved to. And I didn't want anyone to know where I was.
In the months following the murder of Walter Bell, his friends and family members are overwhelmed by the loss. 3 months after his death, Walter's daughter is born.
I gave birth January 29th, 2013. And she was born prematurely. She was born at 28 weeks. When I looked at my baby, I looked at her and I broke down and cried. Reason being, the first thing that I saw when I looked at her, she looked just like her dad did, laying in the casket.
He always talk about when I have a little girl, her name's gonna be Destiny Nicole Bell. All the time, he just wanted a little girl. He got what he finally wanted, and he's not here for it.
Adding to the family's pain, the investigation into Walter's murder is at a standstill. his killer or killers are still out there. In the summer of 2013, almost 9 months after the shootings, Jason Acevedo is arrested in connection with a string of burglaries. But Jason has another crime on his mind.
Mr. Acevedo, with his conjunction with his lawyer, thought it might be in his best interest to now cooperate in this case to give a more satisfactory resolution to his pending felonies. So his lawyer reached out to the police and the district attorney's office and volunteered his client to cooperate.
Jason reveals that he was there when Walter Bell was shot and can tell them exactly who committed the crime.
Prosecutors make a deal, offering Jason Acevedo a reduced sentence in exchange for testimony.
Jason reveals that on October 19, 2012, he was standing on the sidewalk talking to Walter Bell and Shavoki Bloodworth when he was approached by the Lundy brothers. And it was at that point, shots rang out.
Acevedo says both Lundy brothers pulled out guns and started firing at him, Walter, and their friend, Shavoki Bloodworth.
It appears from the investigation, Mr. Acevedo was actually a primary target. That's probably the guy they really would like to have shot that night.
But Jason escaped unscathed. He fled the scene and didn't know Walter had been killed until he saw it on the news 2 weeks later.
His background, if you will, his basis of knowledge that he finally comes through with is pretty high. And so, his credibility, though he's looking out for his own best interest, his credibility in this case is good.
But his statement goes against what would appear to be irrefutable evidence. The data from John Lundy's ankle bracelet.
So that's when they would go back to the ankle monitor and actually start to look at it more closely. In Onondaga County, we have a crime analysis center. One of the analysts there, they were able to look at it more scientifically, and that's when they realized that that the first parole officer looked at it and misread it, or possibly wasn't looking at the actual time that the detective gave him. All of a sudden, okay, boom.
John, in fact, was on Catherine Street that night. At that point, detectives immediately issue a warrant for John Lundy's arrest for the second-degree murder of Walter Bell.
Based on Jason Acevedo's statement, authorities also issue an arrest warrant for Quincy Lundy. He turns himself in.
He was re-interviewed, but didn't give a lot of information. He was arrested for murder in the second degree.
John Lundy remains at large.
They asked the family for John to call them. They had said, well, he's in Texas somewhere. He actually does call the detectives within a day or two and actually left an address that he lived in. But the address was was a fraudulent one. So the U.S. Marshals Task Force in that area started to knock on doors and see if they could find Mr. Lundy.
Months after Walter Bell was gunned down, Syracuse police finally have enough to charge the two men they believe are responsible.
A warrant is issued for the Lundy brothers' arrests. Quincy is first arrested, but then they discover John Lundy flees to Texas.
Investigators do what they can to flush him out, including enlisting the help of the U.S. Marshals and putting pressure on his family.
The police up here at Syracuse still knocking on grandma's and parents' doors. Those efforts must have been enough. Mr. Lundy actually, within a few days thereafter, walks in and turns himself in to a police department down outside of Dallas, Texas. And then he's arrested and later extradited back here to face the charges.
When they finally get John Lundy in custody, he's sticking to the story that he was not anywhere near Catherine Street and that he only heard about the gunshots. But police knew there was more to the story.
Drawn and Quincy Lundy are tried together in October 2014. Latia attends the trial with Walter's mother.
I want to look these guys in their face. I want to know what happened and why it happened.
Deputy Mark Chapman is assigned to transport the brothers to and from court each day.
My partner and I were present throughout the whole trial because of the brothers' custody status. They looked like, college students. They were very quiet, very disciplined in the courtroom.
Quincy Lundy's attorney sticks to the story that Quincy has nothing to do with this shooting and he was at home with his mother. And his mother continues to corroborate the story. She takes the stand to testify for him, but Quincy himself doesn't take the stand. Drawn, on the other hand, takes the stand in his own defense. He admits to the criminal history and admits to the feud with Acevedo, but is adamant about the fact that he had nothing to do with the shooting and did not shoot anyone.
This case was, somewhat circumstantial. We didn't have a murder weapon. They didn't have fingerprint evidence. They didn't have DNA evidence. There wasn't, clear, perfect video. There wasn't a confession. I pictured myself as a juror saying, this could go either way.
Prosecutors attempt to bolster their case by calling the county medical examiner.
Dr. Stoppinger's testimony, they have ways to follow the bullet path as it enters and potentially exits the body. The doctor testified that it appeared that the rounds striking Mr. Bell came from a downward angle. After his testimony, the court took a brief recess. We escorted both brothers from the courtroom to a holding area adjacent to the courtroom and secured them in a holding cell.
Officer Chapman and his partner listen in as the brothers discuss the testimony.
Quincy Lundy said, this doctor is very good for us, for our case. And they then went on to say that it's good for us because we were shooting from up the hill. My partner and I, we look at each other in kind of disbelief. We're like, they basically just confessed to each other that they were shooting.
When the trial resumes, the deputies tell prosecutors what they overheard.
I was hesitant, but law enforcement, we have to adapt. And we did. We testified to exactly what we heard that day.
On October 24th, 2014, the jury returns its verdict.
They were both found guilty of murder in the second degree in Honda County Court and were sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. It wasn't just justice for Walter Bell and his family. It was an effort to stop the violence, right? We're always looking to try to stop the violence because this would have kept going.
When the verdict came in, I got a call from Tia. I was happy, but I said still don't take away the pain because, it's no sin it's gonna amount to the amount of pain that they caused us. I guess you just have to learn to deal with it. You just learn to deal with it.
That verdict just basically told me to get on with life. Get on with your life. Today,
There are murders that shock a community. There are murders that haunt investigators. And then there are murders so brutal, so calculated, and so deeply buried beneath layers of fear and silence that they seem to disappear from reality itself. This is one of those stories. A story that begins with a man vanishing into the darkness of an English seaside town. A story that ends with another man lying dead beside a car, gunned down in broad daylight. A story where the dead could no longer speak, the living were too terrified to talk, and the truth remained hidden for almost 14 years. Because sometimes the perfect crime isn't the one where the killer escapes. Sometimes it's the one where the victim disappears so completely that the world begins to wonder whether a murder ever happened at all. On the evening of August 21, 2001, the town of Hastings looked exactly as it always did. The narrow streets wound through aging neighborhoods. The sea rolled endlessly against the coast. Streetlights cast pale orange reflections across wet pavement. People returned home from work. Families sat down for dinner. Televisions flickered behind curtains. Nothing about that evening suggested that somewhere in the darkness, a man was walking toward the final hours of his life. A man named Jason Martin Smith. What happened next would become one of the most disturbing unsolved murder mysteries in Sussex history. Because Jason Martin Smith did not simply disappear. According to investigators, he was hunted, lured, captured, taken against his will, then subjected to a level of violence so extreme that even seasoned detectives would later struggle to describe it. And yet, despite everything that happened, despite years of investigation, despite countless interviews and court proceedings, his body has never been found. Not a grave. Not a skeleton. Not a burial site. Nothing. It was as though he had been erased from existence. For years, that absence became the center of the mystery. No body. No murder weapon. No crime scene preserved behind police tape. Only whispers. Rumors. Fragments of conversations exchanged in pubs and back alleys. Stories told quietly and then denied the next morning. In Hastings, people talked. But they talked carefully. Because there was something else lurking beneath the surface of Jason's disappearance. Fear. The kind of fear that settles over a community when everyone suspects something terrible has happened, but nobody wants to become the next person involved. Witnesses remembered seeing unusual movements. Cars arriving and leaving. People acting nervous. People asking questions. People suddenly refusing to answer them. Every clue seemed to point toward a violent conspiracy. Yet every path investigators followed eventually vanished into silence. Months turned into years. Years turned into more than a decade. The case appeared destined to remain unsolved forever. But that was only the first death. Because approximately 2 months later, another man entered the story. His name was Jimmy Millen. And unlike Jason Martin Smith, Jimmy's death would not happen in secret. There would be witnesses. There would be gunfire. There would be blood on the pavement. It was October 24, 2001. A cool autumn day. The kind of afternoon where the sky hangs low and grey over southern England. Jimmy Millen was working on a vehicle near his home. An ordinary task. An ordinary moment. The sort of thing nobody remembers because nothing is supposed to happen. Then a motorcycle appeared. 2 riders. Moving with purpose. No hesitation. No confusion. No wasted movement. The bike approached. The passenger raised a firearm. And within seconds, multiple shots shattered the afternoon silence. The attack was swift. Professional. Terrifyingly efficient. When it was over, Jimmy Millen lay dying beside the vehicle. The motorcycle disappeared. The killers vanished. And Hastings was left with another murder. 2 men dead. 2 mysteries. 1 town. At first glance, they appeared unrelated. Different circumstances. Different victims. Different methods. 1 vanished. 1 executed. 1 hidden. 1 public. But investigators would eventually discover a connection that transformed everything. A connection so shocking that it changed the entire direction of the case. Because after Jimmy Millen's murder, members of his own family came forward with information. Information that would send detectives back to the disappearance of Jason Martin Smith. According to accounts later provided to police, Jimmy had allegedly admitted involvement in Jason's death. Not merely knowledge. Involvement. Participation. A confession spoken behind closed doors. Words that could no longer be challenged because the man who allegedly spoke them was now dead himself. Suddenly, what had looked like two separate murders began to resemble chapters of the same story. A story of betrayal. A story of revenge. A story rooted in the criminal underworld operating beneath the surface of everyday life. The deeper investigators dug, the darker the picture became. They uncovered allegations of organized criminal activity. Old grudges. Broken loyalties. Men who trusted one another until fear and self-preservation turned allies into enemies. At the center of everything stood a single accusation. Someone had talked. Someone had provided information. Someone had become known as an informant. And in certain criminal circles, there are few labels more dangerous than that. The consequences can arrive years later. Or days later. Sometimes they arrive in the form of a warning. Sometimes they arrive in the form of a bullet. And sometimes they arrive in the dead of night, when a man enters a vehicle believing he is meeting acquaintances and never returns home again. For detectives, the case became an obsession. Not because murder investigations are unusual, but because this case seemed determined to resist every attempt at resolution. Witnesses changed stories. Memories faded. Evidence disappeared. People who once seemed willing to cooperate suddenly became unavailable. Others claimed they remembered nothing at all. Every answer generated new questions. Every breakthrough revealed another obstacle. The investigation stretched across years. Then more years. Children grew into adults. Relationships ended. Officers retired. Yet the mystery remained alive. Some cases fade because nobody cares anymore. This case refused to fade because too many questions remained unanswered. Where was Jason Martin Smith? What exactly happened during those final hours? Who participated? Who ordered it? Who kept silent? And why did another man end up dead only weeks later? The passage of time should have buried the truth. Instead, it slowly exposed it. Because secrets have weight. And the longer people carry them, the harder they become to hide. 14 years. That is how long investigators waited. 14 years of rumors. 14 years of dead ends. 14 years of wondering whether justice would ever arrive. Then, unexpectedly, the silence began to crack. Old witnesses returned. New information surfaced. Pieces that once seemed meaningless suddenly fit together. The picture became clearer. Not complete, but clear enough. And when the truth finally emerged inside a courtroom, it revealed a crime so ruthless that it shocked even those who had spent years investigating it. A man had disappeared. A body had never been recovered. Yet prosecutors would argue they knew exactly how he died. They would describe violence. Kidnapping. Execution. Dismemberment. A chain of events hidden from the public for more than a decade. The challenge was enormous. How do you prove murder without a body? How do you convince a jury when the victim cannot be found? How do you secure justice when so much evidence has been swallowed by time? The answers would transform this case into one of the most remarkable murder prosecutions in modern British criminal history. But before detectives uncovered the truth, before witnesses testified, before arrests were made, before jurors heard the evidence, there was a town by the sea. A group of men bound together by crime. A betrayal that changed everything. And a summer night in 2001 when Jason Martin Smith stepped into the darkness, unaware that he was about to vanish forever. This is the story of the Hastings double murder. A story of loyalty and revenge. Of fear and silence. Of killers who believed they had erased every trace of their crime. And of the investigators who refused to stop searching for a man whose body was never found. Long before the headlines, before the arrests, before detectives began piecing together fragments of a story that seemed impossible to reconstruct, there was Hastings. To tourists, Hastings was a postcard town. A place where the sea met the land in long stretches of grey-blue water. A place filled with memories of English history, narrow streets, fishing boats, old buildings weathered by decades of salt air, and families looking for a quiet escape from the pace of larger cities. On summer afternoons, Visitors wandered along the seafront carrying bags of fish and chips. Children chased seagulls across the promenade. Elderly couples sat on benches facing the channel, watching distant ships move across the horizon like tiny shadows. It was the kind of place that appeared peaceful from the outside. But like many towns, Hastings had two faces. There was the version visitors saw. And there was the version locals knew. Behind the holiday atmosphere and seaside charm existed another world. A world that rarely appeared in tourist brochures. A world built inside pubs, garages, back rooms, small-time criminal networks, and circles of men who made their money outside the law. The criminal underworld in towns like Hastings was not glamorous. It was not the world of luxury cars and lavish mansions. It was smaller, closer, more personal. The people involved often knew each other for years. Some had grown up together. Some were related through family connections. Others had built relationships through favors, debts, and criminal enterprises. Trust was everything. And betrayal was unforgivable. The criminal landscape of southern England during the late 1990s and early 2000s was filled with individuals operating in the space between organized crime and street-level offending. Some specialized in theft. Others in robbery. Some dealt drugs. Others acted as enforcers, collectors, or facilitators. Most knew one simple rule. Keep your mouth shut. No matter what happened. No matter who got arrested. No matter what police already knew. Silence was currency. Silence was protection. Silence kept people alive. And it was inside this environment that the story of Jason Martin Smith unfolded. Very little about Jason's life suggested that he would one day become the center of one of Sussex's most notorious murder investigations. He was not famous. He was not wealthy. He was not someone whose disappearance would immediately attract national attention. He was simply another man moving through a complicated world, surrounded by people whose lives often intersected with criminal activity. The choices he made gradually placed him closer and closer to danger. Like many people operating on the edges of crime, Jason existed within networks where loyalty mattered more than legality. Relationships were built on mutual benefit. People helped each other. They protected each other. And when trouble appeared, everyone was expected to follow the same unwritten rules. Those rules had existed long before Jason entered the picture. And they would continue long after he disappeared. By 2001, tensions were already developing inside certain criminal circles connected to a robbery in Hampshire. The target was a pawn shop. A seemingly ordinary business that became the focus of a criminal operation involving multiple participants. For those involved, the robbery represented opportunity. Money. Status. A chance to profit. But criminal ventures rarely go exactly as planned. Every participant carries risk. Every plan contains weaknesses. And every crime creates the possibility that someone will eventually talk. The robbery attracted police attention. Investigators began examining those involved. Names surfaced. Questions were asked. Pressure increased. Soon, arrests followed. Among the individuals caught in the aftermath was Jason Martin Smith. Being arrested creates a particular kind of fear. The fear of prison. The fear of losing freedom. The fear of realizing that the future suddenly depends on decisions made inside interview rooms and police stations. For some people, pressure hardens their resolve. For others, it breaks them. Inside criminal circles, there are endless rumors about who talks and who stays silent. Sometimes those rumors are true. Sometimes they are completely false. What matters is not always reality. What matters is what people believe. And somewhere within those circles, a belief began to spread. People started whispering that Jason had provided information. That he had spoken to police. That he had become what criminals despise most. An informant. Whether every detail of those accusations was accurate mattered less than the fact that others believed them. Because once suspicion takes hold, it develops a life of its own. Every conversation becomes evidence. Every coincidence appears suspicious. Every interaction is viewed through a lens of distrust. Men who once shared drinks together begin watching one another differently. Phone calls become shorter. Meetings become less frequent. Paranoia grows. And paranoia is one of the most dangerous forces inside criminal organizations. Unlike ordinary anger, paranoia never rests. It searches constantly for threats. It transforms uncertainty into certainty. It convinces people they are acting in self-defense even when they are planning violence. As the summer of 2001 unfolded, the atmosphere surrounding Jason became increasingly dangerous. The people around him knew things. Or believed they knew things. Conversations occurred behind closed doors. Stories circulated from one group to another. A name would be mentioned. Someone would nod. Someone else would lower their voice. No official warning was ever issued. No public declaration existed. Yet an invisible verdict seemed to be forming. For certain individuals, Jason Martin Smith had crossed a line. And in their minds, that line could not be uncrossed. The irony was that everyday life continued around them. The rest of Hastings remained largely unaware. People still walked their dogs along the seafront. Fishermen still prepared boats before dawn. Shopkeepers still opened their businesses every morning. Teenagers still gathered in parks during warm evenings. The ordinary rhythm of life continued uninterrupted. That is one of the most unsettling aspects of many true crime cases. The future tragedy already exists. The forces that will eventually produce violence are already in motion. Yet the world carries on as though nothing is wrong. Because nobody can see the storm approaching. Imagine Hastings during August of 2001. The air carrying traces of salt from the sea. Clouds drifting above rows of houses. Traffic moving through familiar streets. People going about their routines. Somewhere among them walks Jason. He does not know that investigators will one day spend years trying to determine exactly how he died. He does not know that witnesses will later describe horrific acts of violence. He does not know that a jury years later will hear evidence suggesting he suffered a brutal fate from which there was no escape. At that moment, he is simply living another day. And perhaps that is what makes stories like this so haunting. The victims never see the narrative the way we do. We look backward with knowledge. They move forward without it. Every decision appears ordinary. Every meeting feels routine. Every phone call seems insignificant. Until suddenly it isn't. Somewhere in Hastings, plans were already taking shape. Not plans visible to the public. Not plans documented on paper. The kind of plans formed through conversations. Promises. Threats. Assumptions. The kind of plans that leave no official record. Individuals allegedly connected to Jason's fate continued their lives as normal. They visited friends. Spent time with family. Went to pubs. Worked jobs. Laughed. Talked. Moved through the community without attracting unusual attention. Nothing about their outward appearance suggested that they were approaching a moment that would later become one of the darkest chapters in local criminal history. Because evil rarely announces itself. It often arrives wearing ordinary clothes. Driving ordinary cars. Speaking in ordinary voices. By the third week of August, the tension surrounding Jason had reached a point from which there would be no return. Whatever suspicions existed had hardened. Whatever grievances had formed had intensified. The social bonds that once connected people were beginning to fracture. Trust had been replaced by resentment. Resentment had been replaced by anger. And anger was slowly becoming something much more dangerous. Soon, a meeting would be arranged. A destination would be chosen. A trap would be prepared. One man would believe he was going somewhere familiar. Instead, he would be stepping into a nightmare. A nightmare that would remain hidden for nearly 14 years. And while Hastings slept beneath the fading light of another summer evening, nobody could have imagined that the town was only hours away from producing a mystery that would haunt detectives for more than a decade. The sea continued to roll against the shore. The streetlights flickered on. Darkness settled across the town. And somewhere in that darkness, the final chapter of Jason Martin Smith's life was about to begin. When people hear about a murder case, especially one surrounded by violence, criminal associations, and years of mystery, there is often a tendency to see the victim only through the lens of the crime itself. A name in a headline. A face attached to a police investigation. A missing person. A body that was never found. A witness statement. A piece of evidence. But before any of those things existed, Jason Martin Smith was simply a human being. A son. A friend. A familiar face to people who knew him. Someone who woke up in the morning with plans, worries, frustrations, and hopes that stretched beyond the next day. That reality is often lost when a case becomes famous. The victim becomes part of the story instead of the reason the story exists. And in Jason's case, the passage of time only deepened that problem. For more than a decade, conversations about him focused on one question. What happened to him? The question was understandable. His disappearance was extraordinary. The allegations surrounding his death were horrific. The mystery captivated investigators for years. Yet beneath all those questions remained another one. Who was Jason Martin Smith? To understand the answer, it is necessary to look beyond the courtroom evidence and police files. Because the tragedy that unfolded in August of 2001 did not begin with violence. It began with an ordinary life. Like many men in their social circles, Jason's world was complicated. He was neither entirely removed from criminal activity nor the powerful figure some people later imagined. He occupied the gray area where countless individuals find themselves. Close enough to crime to become involved. Not powerful enough to control the consequences. People who knew him described a man who could be sociable and approachable. Someone capable of forming friendships and maintaining relationships. Someone who moved through familiar communities where everybody seemed to know somebody connected to somebody else. In towns like Hastings and the surrounding areas, social networks overlap constantly. Friends become acquaintances. Acquaintances become business partners. Business partners become rivals. And sometimes those lines blur so completely that nobody remembers exactly where one relationship ends and another begins. Jason lived within that environment. It shaped the people around him. It shaped the opportunities available to him. And ultimately, it shaped the dangers he faced. Looking back now, one of the most tragic aspects of his story is how ordinary many of his final weeks likely appeared from the outside. There were no newspaper warnings. No public declarations. No dramatic confrontations taking place in front of witnesses. No signs visible to strangers walking down the street. Life continued much as it always had. The sea still rolled against the shore. Cars still moved through Hastings. Pubs still filled with conversations each evening. Yet beneath that ordinary surface, suspicion was growing. Somewhere within criminal circles, Jason's name had become associated with betrayal. Whether he fully understood the extent of that danger remains impossible to know. What investigators would later discover, however, was that certain individuals had become convinced he had spoken to police following the Hampshire pawnshop robbery. In criminal culture, accusations of informing carry a unique weight. Unlike financial disputes or personal arguments, informing is viewed as a violation that threatens everyone connected to the group. It creates fear. Fear that arrests will follow. Fear that secrets have already been exposed. Fear that years of criminal activity may suddenly become evidence. The result is often paranoia. And paranoia has a way of transforming rumors into perceived facts. Perhaps the most chilling element is that people do not need proof to act upon fear. They only need belief. Once enough people become convinced that someone has betrayed them, reality becomes secondary. The accusation itself becomes the crime. That appears to be what happened around Jason Martin Smith. As summer progressed, whispers became assumptions. Assumptions became convictions. Convictions became resentment. And resentment slowly evolved into something much darker. If Jason sensed any of this, he may have believed he could navigate it. Human beings are remarkably skilled at convincing themselves danger is manageable. We tell ourselves things will calm down. We tell ourselves misunderstandings can be explained. We tell ourselves people we know would never truly harm us. History is filled with victims who walked willingly into situations because they trusted the wrong people. Trust is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology. It allows society to function. It allows friendships to exist. It allows families to remain connected. Yet trust also creates vulnerability. The people most capable of hurting us are often the people closest to us. The people who know our routines. The people who understand our habits. The people who know which phone call we will answer and which invitation we will accept. That truth would become devastatingly important in Jason's story. Because according to later investigations, he did not disappear after a random encounter with strangers. He was allegedly lured. Drawn into a situation through familiarity. The trap depended upon trust. And trust made it possible. Imagine Jason during those final days. The summer air still lingering across southern England. The long daylight hours gradually shortening as August approached its end. The routine conversations. The ordinary errands. The countless small decisions that make up everyday life. None of them seemed remarkable at the time. No one wakes up expecting their life to end. No one leaves home believing they are about to become a missing person. For Jason, the future probably still existed. There were likely plans waiting for tomorrow. People he intended to see. Conversations he expected to have. Problems he assumed he would solve. That is what makes the final day of a victim's life so haunting. The victim experiences it as normal. Everyone else experiences it as the beginning of a tragedy. As August 21, 2001 unfolded, there was no public indication that anything extraordinary was about to happen. The town moved through another day. Shops opened. Traffic flowed. People went to work. Evening approached. And somewhere within Hastings, Jason continued moving through his routine. At some point, arrangements were allegedly made. A meeting. A destination. A reason to travel. Details that would later become central to the investigation. From Jason's perspective, the request may have seemed routine. There is no evidence suggesting he believed he was walking into immediate danger. That lack of awareness would ultimately become one of the cruelest aspects of the case. Because while Jason moved toward the meeting, other individuals may already have known exactly what was going to happen. One side anticipated a conversation. The other side may have been preparing an abduction. One side expected familiarity. The other side may have been planning violence. The imbalance is chilling. It transformed what appeared to be an ordinary interaction into an irreversible moment. Years later, investigators would spend enormous amounts of time reconstructing those final movements. Witness statements. Timelines. Fragments of memory. Every detail mattered. Where had Jason gone? Who had seen him? Who spoke with him? What vehicle was present? What route was taken? The challenge was immense because so much time had passed. Memories fade. People forget. Events blur together. Yet despite those obstacles, a picture slowly emerged. And that picture suggested that Jason's disappearance was neither spontaneous nor accidental. It was purposeful. Deliberate. Planned. The realization changed everything. Missing persons cases often begin with uncertainty. Perhaps someone left voluntarily. Perhaps they experienced an accident. Perhaps they intended to return and never had the chance. In Jason's case, investigators increasingly came to believe there had been no mystery about whether violence occurred. The mystery was who committed it and how thoroughly they concealed it afterward. For Jason's loved ones, the uncertainty must have been unbearable. When a body is recovered, grief eventually receives confirmation. Painful confirmation, but confirmation nonetheless. Families know what happened. They can begin the difficult process of mourning. When no body exists, that process becomes infinitely more complicated. Questions remain suspended in time. Hope survives even when logic says it should not. Every phone call becomes significant. Every rumor matters. Every reported sighting creates another emotional roller coaster. The mind searches desperately for answers. And in Jason's case, answers seemed impossible to find. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Months became years. Still, there was no body. No burial site. No physical proof that could provide closure. Only absence. A silence so complete that it seemed to swallow the truth itself. Yet silence has limits. People carry secrets differently. Some bury them. Some deny them. Some attempt to forget. Others eventually break beneath the weight. The remarkable thing about this case is not simply that Jason disappeared. It is that despite the extraordinary effort allegedly made to erase him, traces remained. Witnesses remembered fragments. Conversations resurfaced. Rumors persisted. The truth lingered like a shadow at the edge of every investigation. It never disappeared entirely. And perhaps that is the ultimate lesson contained within Jason Martin Smith's story. Human beings can destroy evidence. They can hide bodies. They can intimidate witnesses. They can convince themselves a crime has been buried forever. But the past has a way of leaving fingerprints. Sometimes those fingerprints are physical. Sometimes they exist inside memory. Sometimes they survive as guilty secrets carried for years by people who can never completely escape what they have done. Jason Martin Smith's life ended before he had any opportunity to defend himself against the accusations surrounding him. Whether he understood the full extent of the danger remains unknown. Whether he sensed betrayal closing around him remains unknown. What is known is that he walked into the final hours of his life unaware that his name would one day become synonymous with one of Sussex's most infamous murder investigations. He could not know that detectives would spend years searching for him. He could not know that prosecutors would one day argue his killers believed they had eliminated every trace of his existence. He could not know that a courtroom more than a decade later would hear evidence describing a level of violence almost unimaginable. And he certainly could not know that his body would never be found. For the people who loved him, the coming days would bring fear. Then confusion. Then heartbreak. For investigators, they would bring a mystery unlike any they had faced before. And for Jason himself, August 21st, 2001 would become the final chapter of a life that deserved to be remembered as more than evidence in a murder case. Because before he was a victim, he was a person. And before he became the center of a criminal investigation, he was simply a man living what he believed was another ordinary day. A day that would end with his disappearance. A disappearance that would soon evolve into a nightmare. And a nightmare that was only beginning. The final hours of Jason Martin Smith's life began like countless other evenings. The sky above Hastings slowly shifted from pale afternoon light into the muted colors of dusk. Traffic moved through the town's streets. People returned home from work. Curtains were drawn across windows. Television screens flickered inside living rooms. Along the coast, waves continued their endless rhythm against the shoreline, indifferent to the events that were beginning to unfold elsewhere in the town. Nothing about the evening announced the violence that was coming. No alarms sounded. No one called the police. No one knew that a man was about to disappear forever. Somewhere within Hastings, arrangements had been made. The exact words exchanged have never been fully known. Investigators would later spend years trying to reconstruct conversations that existed only in memory. What they eventually came to believe was that Jason had been lured into a meeting. It was not a chance encounter. It was not a random act of violence. According to the evidence presented years later, this was a deliberate operation. The trap depended on one crucial element: trust. Jason had to believe he was meeting people he knew. He had to believe there was no immediate danger. Without that trust, the plan would have failed before it began. That is often the most disturbing feature of organized violence. The victim is not overpowered immediately. First, they are persuaded, encouraged, guided toward a situation from which escape becomes impossible. As darkness gradually settled over Hastings, Jason moved toward that point of no return. Perhaps he expected a conversation. Perhaps he expected an explanation. Perhaps he believed the tensions that had been growing around him could still be managed. Whatever thoughts occupied his mind that evening, there is no evidence suggesting he anticipated what was waiting for him. At some stage during the night of August 21st, witnesses would later describe seeing Jason being confronted. What happened next unfolded quickly. According to testimony gathered during the investigation, Jason was seized against his will. The transformation from ordinary evening to life-threatening crisis likely occurred within seconds. One moment he was speaking. The next he was fighting for control of his own movements. Fighting for freedom. Fighting to understand what was happening. People often imagine kidnapping as something dramatic and prolonged, but in reality it can occur with terrifying speed. Several determined individuals can overwhelm a single person before they have time to react. Shock becomes a weapon. Confusion becomes a weapon. Numbers become a weapon. Every second lost to disbelief benefits the attackers. Investigators later concluded that Jason was forcibly placed into a vehicle. Whether he shouted for help remains unknown. Whether nearby residents heard anything remains unknown. What is known is that after that encounter, Jason effectively vanished from public view. For his attackers, the abduction was only the beginning. For Jason, it marked the end of any realistic chance of survival. The vehicle carrying him disappeared into the night. Streetlights illuminated empty roads. Houses stood silent behind closed doors. The town continued sleeping, unaware that a human being was being transported toward an unimaginable fate. Kidnapping creates a unique form of terror. Murder is often instantaneous. Kidnapping introduces time. Time to think. Time to fear. Time to realize that events are moving beyond your control. Investigators would later argue that Jason was taken to a location where those responsible could act without interruption. Away from witnesses. Away from strangers. Away from any possibility of rescue. The exact location would become one of the most important questions in the entire case. Years later, witness accounts would point investigators toward a lock-up garage. An ordinary structure from the outside. The kind of place people pass every day without a second glance. A garage is not supposed to become a crime scene. It is supposed to store tools, vehicles, equipment, forgotten possessions. Yet according to evidence later presented, one such location may have become the setting for extraordinary violence. Imagine Jason arriving there. The realization that the meeting had been a lie. The realization that escape was unlikely. The realization that the people surrounding him were no longer pretending. Human beings possess an extraordinary survival instinct. Even when hope disappears, the mind searches desperately for possibilities. A way out. A mistake by the attackers. An opportunity to run. A chance to reason with them. A chance to survive. But survival becomes difficult when violence has already been decided in advance. Investigators eventually pieced together a horrifying theory of what occurred after the kidnapping. According to evidence presented years later, Jason was subjected to a sustained attack. The assault was not merely an act of rage. It appeared designed to punish. To send a message. To eliminate someone perceived as a threat. Within criminal organizations, punishment killings often carry symbolic value. They are intended not only to remove an individual but also to reinforce a lesson. This is what happens to people who betray us. This is what happens to people who talk. Whether those beliefs were justified mattered little to the men allegedly responsible. By that stage, they appear to have already decided that Jason's fate was sealed. The violence escalated. At some point, according to investigators, Jason was shot. A gunshot introduces a finality that cannot be ignored. Arguments can end. Threats can change. Physical assaults can stop. A gunshot changes everything. It crosses a boundary beyond which there is no return. Yet the evidence later suggested that the violence did not end there. Detectives would eventually conclude that Jason was also strangled. The image is chilling. Not because of the physical act alone, but because strangulation requires proximity. It requires direct contact. It requires a killer to remain close to the victim. To witness fear. To witness suffering. To continue despite both. Psychologists who study violent crime often note that strangulation reveals something deeply personal about an attack. It places the offender within inches of the victim. There is no distance. No separation. No abstraction. Only direct human violence. What exactly occurred during those final moments can never be fully known. Jason cannot tell his story. The people responsible spent years denying involvement. The truth exists only in fragments. Witness accounts. Investigative conclusions. Physical evidence gathered long after the fact. Yet those fragments paint a horrifying picture. A man accused of betrayal. A carefully arranged kidnapping. A brutal attack. And a death hidden from the world. For many killers, murder itself becomes the objective. In this case, investigators believed there was another stage. The disappearance. Because killing someone is one thing. Erasing them is another. The challenge facing those responsible was obvious. A body creates evidence. A body allows investigators to establish cause of death. A body gives families answers. A body can speak long after the victim is gone. Without a body, every investigation becomes more difficult. That realization appears to have influenced what happened next. According to later testimony, extraordinary efforts were made to ensure Jason would never be found. The details shocked even experienced detectives. Investigators concluded that after Jason's death, his body was dismembered. The allegation transformed the case from a murder investigation into something even more disturbing. Dismemberment is rarely spontaneous. It requires decisions, time, preparation, and a willingness to cross moral boundaries that most people cannot even imagine. The purpose is often practical. Destroy evidence. Complicate identification. Prevent discovery. But beneath those practical goals lies something darker. The reduction of a human being into a problem that must be solved. A body that must disappear. A witness who can never testify. A life treated as an inconvenience. Somewhere during those hours, according to investigators, Jason Martin Smith ceased being a person in the eyes of his killers. He became evidence. And evidence had to be removed. The exact disposal method has never been conclusively established. That mystery remains one of the most frustrating aspects of the case. Despite years of investigation, despite arrests and convictions, despite courtroom testimony, Jason's remains have never been recovered. Somewhere, the answer still exists. Somewhere, there is a location known only to a handful of people. A place that has remained hidden for more than 2 decades. The absence of that discovery continues to haunt everyone connected to the case. Because finding a body changes things. It creates certainty. It creates closure. Without it, the story always feels unfinished. As the night progressed, those allegedly involved in Jason's death faced a new challenge. Life had to continue. Conversations had to be managed. Questions had to be anticipated. The disappearance would eventually attract attention. People would ask where Jason had gone. Friends would notice his absence. Family members would become concerned. A successful cover-up required more than violence. It required discipline, silence, coordination. Every participant needed to maintain the same version of events. Every inconsistency carried risk. Every careless statement created danger. The conspiracy, if investigators were correct, did not end with the murder. It continued afterward through secrecy. Yet secrecy is fragile. People talk. Relationships change. Loyalties shift. Fear weakens over time. The longer a secret survives, the more opportunities exist for it to escape. That reality would eventually become crucial. Because less than 24 hours after Jason vanished, something happened that investigators would later consider highly significant. Witnesses reportedly observed suspicious activity connected to individuals who would eventually become central to the case. A lock-up garage. Blood. An axe. Details that sounded almost unbelievable. Details that would linger in investigators' minds for years. At the time, however, those observations were only fragments. Pieces without a complete picture. No one yet understood how important they would become. No one yet understood that Jason Martin Smith was already dead. The town awoke the next morning as it always did. People went to work. Children went to school. Businesses opened. The sea continued rolling toward shore. Hastings appeared unchanged. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. A man had vanished. A murder had allegedly occurred. Evidence was being hidden. And somewhere within the community, individuals were carrying knowledge that would remain buried for nearly 14 years. The incident itself had lasted only hours. The consequences would last decades. For Jason's loved ones, the nightmare was just beginning. For investigators, the mystery had not even started. And for the people allegedly responsible, a dangerous assumption was beginning to take hold. They believed the crime had been erased. They believed the victim had disappeared forever. They believed silence would protect them. For a long time, it seemed they were right. But secrets have a habit of surviving longer than the people who keep them. And the secret of what happened during that August night in 2001 was already beginning its long journey back into the light. When a person vanishes, there is usually a period of uncertainty. Hours pass. Then days. Family members begin making phone calls. Friends check familiar locations. Employers wonder why someone has not shown up. Small concerns slowly transform into larger fears. At first, people search for ordinary explanations. Maybe the person left unexpectedly. Maybe they needed time alone. Maybe there has been some misunderstanding. Human beings naturally resist worst-case scenarios. We prefer explanations that allow hope to survive. For the people connected to Jason Martin Smith, those first days after his disappearance likely followed a similar pattern. Questions emerged. Where was he? Who had seen him last? Why had nobody heard from him? Every unanswered question deepened the growing sense that something was wrong. As concern increased, investigators began attempting to establish a timeline. The process sounds straightforward, but in reality it is often one of the most difficult stages of any missing person investigation. People remember events differently. Memories change. Witnesses disagree. A conversation that seems important months later may have felt completely insignificant at the time. Detectives needed to determine where Jason had gone, who he had met, and what had happened during the final hours before he disappeared. Those answers did not come easily. From the very beginning, the case carried an unusual atmosphere. Experienced investigators often describe certain disappearances as feeling wrong. There may be no body, no crime scene, no confession. Yet something about the circumstances suggests the person did not leave voluntarily. Jason's disappearance quickly began generating that feeling. The absence itself became suspicious. People disappear intentionally all the time. But most leave traces behind. Bank activity. Phone calls. Sightings. Contact with friends or relatives. Jason seemed to vanish into a void. The deeper investigators looked, the less sense the disappearance made. And then came the first fragments of information that suggested a much darker possibility. Witnesses began providing accounts that painted a troubling picture. Not a complete picture. Not enough to solve the case. But enough to raise serious concerns. Among the most significant reports were claims involving a lock-up garage connected to individuals who would later become central figures in the investigation. At the time, these observations may have seemed disconnected. Pieces of a puzzle scattered across different conversations and statements. Yet years later, They would become some of the most important elements in reconstructing what happened. One witness described seeing suspicious activity around the garage shortly after Jason's disappearance. Another reported observations that suggested violence had occurred there. There were references to blood. References to individuals behaving nervously. References to an axe. Each detail on its own could potentially be explained away. Together, they created a deeply disturbing pattern. Detectives understood something important. People rarely invent the same story independently. When separate accounts begin pointing toward the same location, the same individuals, and the same sequence of events, investigators pay attention. The challenge was proving what those accounts actually meant. Blood alone does not automatically prove murder. A garage is not automatically a crime scene. An axe is not automatically evidence of a homicide. Every clue required verification. Every statement required scrutiny. Every possibility required examination. Meanwhile, Jason remained missing. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Still there was no sign of him. No confirmed sightings. No communication. Nothing. The silence grew heavier with every passing day. For detectives, the absence of a body presented an enormous obstacle. Bodies tell stories. Forensic evidence can establish injuries. Pathologists can determine cause of death. Physical remains provide certainty. Without those elements, investigators were forced to rely heavily on witness testimony and circumstantial evidence. That created challenges from the very beginning. Because witness testimony is fragile. People forget details. People become frightened. People change their stories. Some witnesses genuinely misremember events. Others deliberately conceal information. In criminal environments, the problem becomes even more severe. Fear spreads quickly. A witness who speaks today may decide tomorrow that silence is safer. And silence was becoming a recurring theme in Jason's case. The investigators were not merely fighting a lack of evidence. They were fighting a culture of fear. People appeared reluctant to cooperate. Some individuals seemed willing to discuss rumors privately but refused to make formal statements. Others claimed ignorance despite evidence suggesting they knew more than they admitted. Detectives repeatedly encountered the same invisible wall. Every promising lead seemed to end just before reaching the truth. Yet despite those frustrations, one conclusion was becoming increasingly difficult to avoid. Jason Martin Smith had not simply walked away from his life. Something had happened to him. Something violent. Something deliberate. As investigators pursued that possibility, another event dramatically altered the trajectory of the case. Approximately 2 months after Jason vanished, another man entered the story. His name was Jimmy Millen. Unlike Jason's disappearance, Jimmy's fate unfolded in public. There would be witnesses. There would be no uncertainty about whether violence had occurred. The attack happened on October 24, 2001. The day began like any other. No one could have predicted that before it ended, another life would be lost. Jimmy was working on a vehicle near his home. It was an ordinary scene. A man carrying out a routine task. A moment so common that nobody would normally pay attention. Then a motorcycle approached. 2 riders. Purposeful. Focused. Moving with the confidence of people who knew exactly what they intended to do. What happened next occurred with frightening speed. The passenger produced a firearm. Shots rang out. The attack was swift and devastating. Within moments, Jimmy Millen had been mortally wounded. The motorcycle disappeared. The killers escaped. And Hastings suddenly found itself confronting another murder. At first glance, the connection between the 2 cases was unclear. One victim had vanished. The other had been executed in broad daylight. The methods were completely different. The circumstances appeared unrelated. Yet experienced investigators understand that appearances can be deceptive. The criminal world is often interconnected in ways invisible to outsiders. Individuals move through overlapping networks. Enemies become allies. Allies become liabilities. And sometimes a second crime reveals the truth about the first. That possibility gained credibility when information emerged from an unexpected source. Jimmy Millant's own family. Following his death, relatives reportedly approached investigators with information that would transform the entire investigation. According to accounts later provided to police, Jimmy had spoken about Jason Martin Smith. Not casually. Not as a distant observer. But as someone who allegedly possessed direct knowledge of what happened. The revelation stunned investigators. For months, they had struggled to determine whether Jason's disappearance involved murder. Now they were hearing claims that Jimmy himself had admitted involvement. The implications were enormous. If true, it meant the two cases were connected. If true, it meant Jason had indeed been killed. If true, it meant multiple individuals may have participated. Most importantly, it suggested that the answers detectives had been searching for were hidden within a network of people already known to them. The challenge, however, remained the same. Information is not evidence. Confessions reported secondhand are difficult to verify. Witnesses may misunderstand conversations. Memories may become distorted over time. Investigators needed corroboration. Something stronger. Something that could survive scrutiny in court. Yet despite those limitations, the family's information fundamentally changed the direction of the investigation. The focus shifted. Theories evolved. The possibility of a larger conspiracy became increasingly difficult to ignore. What had once appeared to be a missing person case was now being viewed through a different lens. A kidnapping. A murder. A cover-up. Possibly followed by a second killing. The emerging picture was both fascinating and terrifying. Detectives began exploring whether Jimmy's murder could somehow be linked to Jason's death. Had he been killed because he knew too much? Had someone feared he might eventually talk? Had old disputes resurfaced? Or was the timing merely a coincidence? The answers remained elusive. Even today, no definitive conclusion has been reached regarding Jimmy's murder. His killing remains officially unsolved. Yet the overlap between the two cases proved impossible to ignore. The more investigators examined the connections, the more they became convinced that both crimes belonged to the same broader narrative. A narrative built around loyalty, betrayal, and fear. As months became years, detectives continued gathering information. Some witnesses came forward. Others disappeared from the investigation. Certain leads appeared promising before collapsing under scrutiny. Every step forward seemed to produce another obstacle. The case became a marathon rather than a sprint. One of the most frustrating aspects involved the garage. The location lingered in the minds of investigators. Witness accounts repeatedly drew attention back to it. Blood had reportedly been observed. Suspicious behavior had reportedly occurred. Yet years passed without enough evidence to fully establish what had happened there. The garage became a symbol of the entire investigation. A place that seemed to contain answers while simultaneously withholding them. Detectives returned to it again and again, hoping a new witness or fresh piece of information might finally unlock its secrets. But the years kept passing. Evidence aged. Memories faded. Witnesses moved away. Some individuals died. Others became increasingly unwilling to cooperate. For many investigators, the case appeared trapped in a state of permanent uncertainty. They believed they understood the broad outline of what happened. They simply could not prove it. And that distinction matters. Belief is not enough. Suspicion is not enough. Courts require evidence. Jurors require evidence. Justice requires evidence. Without it, even the strongest theories remain only theories. As the first decade after Jason's disappearance came and went, many people assumed the truth would never emerge. The body had never been found. The principal witnesses remained problematic. The passage of time favored those responsible. Every year made prosecution more difficult. Every year increased the likelihood that crucial information would be lost forever. Yet beneath the surface, investigators refused to let the case die. Files remained open. Names remained on lists. Questions remained unanswered. And somewhere within those unanswered questions lay the key to solving a mystery that had haunted Hastings since the summer of 2001. The discovery phase of the investigation had produced fragments. A kidnapping. A garage. Blood. An axe. A second murder. Rumors of confessions. Years of silence. Individually, they were incomplete. Together, they formed the outline of something much larger. Something terrible. Something that investigators believed had been hidden in the shadows for far too long. The challenge now was transforming suspicion into proof. And that would require a breakthrough no one could yet see coming. By the time the investigation entered its second year, detectives were facing a problem that has destroyed countless murder cases before it. They believed a crime had occurred. They believed they knew roughly why it had occurred. They believed a group of individuals held the answers. But belief and proof are separated by a dangerous distance. And in Jason Martin Smith's case, that distance seemed impossible to cross. The victim was gone. The body had never been recovered. No murder weapon had been conclusively identified. No forensic scene existed that could tell investigators exactly what had happened. The case appeared trapped inside a fog of rumors, suspicions, and half-finished stories. For many detectives, this was the most frustrating kind of investigation imaginable. A missing person case can often be solved through physical evidence. A conventional murder investigation can be guided by a crime scene. But Jason's case occupied a strange territory somewhere in between. There were signs of violence. There were allegations. There were witnesses. Yet every path toward certainty seemed to disappear into darkness. The first challenge was separating fact from fiction. Within criminal circles, rumors spread quickly. One person hears a story and tells another. The details change. New elements are added. Old elements disappear. After enough time, nobody can remember where the original information came from. Detectives soon found themselves drowning in rumors. Some claimed Jason had fled the country. Others insisted he was buried somewhere in rural Sussex. Some believed he had been killed immediately after being abducted. Others suggested he had been held alive for a period before being murdered. Every theory seemed possible. None could be proven. Investigators conducted interviews. Then more interviews. Then hundreds more. Each witness appeared to possess a small fragment of the truth. No one seemed to possess the entire picture. The investigation became an exercise in patience. One detective later described cases like this as assembling a jigsaw puzzle while half the pieces are missing and the remaining pieces belong to different boxes. That description perfectly captured the challenge facing the inquiry. A witness might remember seeing a vehicle. Another might remember hearing a conversation. A third might recall someone behaving strangely after Jason vanished. Individually, those details appeared insignificant. Collectively, they hinted at something much larger. Yet connecting them required time. And time was becoming the enemy. Months passed. Then years. Memories faded. People relocated. Relationships changed. The further investigators moved from August 2001, the harder it became to reconstruct events accurately. Human memory is not a recording device. It changes continuously. Each recollection reshapes the memory itself. People forget dates, confuse locations, combine separate events into a single narrative. By the third or fourth year of the investigation, detectives were not merely trying to solve a murder. They were racing against the gradual erosion of memory itself. Complicating matters further was the culture surrounding those believed to be involved. Many of the individuals connected to the investigation lived within a world governed by its own rules. Loyalty carried enormous value. Distrust of law enforcement ran deep. Cooperation with police could have serious consequences. Some witnesses appeared frightened. Others appeared openly hostile. Several refused to discuss events altogether. Even those willing to speak often seemed careful, measured, selective. Detectives frequently sensed there was more beneath the surface than anyone was willing to admit. The fear surrounding the case was impossible to ignore. Investigators would later encounter individuals who clearly possessed information yet seemed terrified of sharing it. That fear became one of the defining characteristics of the inquiry. Years after Jason disappeared, people were still afraid. That alone told detectives something important. Fear does not survive for years without a reason. Fear requires a source, a threat, a memory, a belief that consequences remain possible. Somewhere within the community, people continued carrying secrets. The challenge was convincing them to reveal those secrets. The lock-up garage remained central to the investigation. Again and again, witness statements drew detectives back toward that location. The reports were troubling. Accounts involving blood. Accounts involving suspicious behavior. Accounts involving tools that seemed disturbingly consistent with later theories about what happened to Jason. Yet despite its significance, the garage refused to provide definitive answers. Without timely forensic opportunities, much of the physical evidence investigators desperately needed had long since disappeared. The passage of time had worked in favor of whoever was responsible. If a crime had occurred there, years of environmental exposure and human activity had likely destroyed valuable traces. Still, detectives continued returning to the garage in interviews and investigative reviews. Because sometimes physical evidence disappears while human memory survives. And memory was increasingly becoming the investigation's most valuable resource. As years passed, the inquiry expanded beyond traditional evidence gathering. Detectives began focusing on relationships, friendships, conflicts, criminal associations. The social network surrounding Jason became a map investigators studied repeatedly. Who knew whom? Who had motives? Who had been present during key events? Who benefited from Jason's disappearance? The answers gradually revealed patterns. Certain names appeared repeatedly. Certain individuals seemed connected through multiple independent sources. These recurring names became subjects of intense scrutiny. Yet suspicion remained insufficient. The investigators needed something stronger. Meanwhile, the murder of Jimmy Millen continued casting a shadow across the case. The more detectives examined his death, the harder it became to ignore potential connections. Jimmy had allegedly possessed knowledge regarding Jason's fate. Family members had provided information suggesting involvement. Then Jimmy himself had been murdered. Whether the two events were directly linked remained unproven. But the timing was impossible to dismiss. Detectives considered numerous possibilities. Perhaps Jimmy's murder was retaliation. Perhaps it was unrelated. Perhaps it stemmed from entirely separate criminal disputes. Each possibility required investigation. Each possibility consumed valuable resources. The result was a case that seemed to expand rather than shrink. Every answer produced new questions. Every lead opened additional avenues of inquiry. The complexity became overwhelming. Some investigations moved steadily toward resolution. This one seemed trapped inside a maze. The emotional toll on detectives should not be underestimated. Popular culture often portrays investigators as detached professionals. In reality, many become deeply invested in unsolved cases. They carry them home. Think about them during weekends. Replay witness statements in their minds. Search endlessly for the detail everyone else has missed. Jason's disappearance became one of those cases. Years after the initial investigation began, officers still found themselves returning to the same questions. Where was the body? Who knew the truth? Why would no one talk? And perhaps most frustratingly, how could so many people seem aware that something terrible had happened while nobody provided enough information to prove it? The answers remained elusive. By the mid-2000s, some observers began assuming the case would never be solved. The public's attention faded. New crimes occurred. New investigations dominated headlines. Yet within police files, Jason Martin Smith remained present. A name waiting for resolution. A victim waiting for justice. Behind closed doors, detectives continued reviewing evidence. Fresh eyes examined old statements. New investigators inherited the work of predecessors. Each generation of officers hoped they might discover what others had missed. Sometimes they found inconsistencies. Sometimes they uncovered forgotten details. Occasionally they identified witnesses who deserved re-interviewing. Small developments occurred. None appeared sufficient to break the case open. Then there was the issue of loyalty. One of the most fascinating aspects of long-term criminal conspiracies is how relationships evolve. The people who protect each other today may become enemies tomorrow. Friendships fracture. Business arrangements collapse. Resentments grow. The passage of time changes everything. Detectives understood this. They knew that secrets become harder to maintain as years pass. People age. People mature. People experience guilt. Some become less willing to carry burdens they once accepted. Others decide their loyalty is no longer worth the cost. That realization shaped investigative strategy. Officers remained patient. They understood that time, while damaging evidence, could also weaken silence. Every year increased the possibility that someone would eventually decide to talk. The waiting game continued. Interviews were revisited. Statements were re-examined. Old files were reopened. Names were cross-referenced. The investigation slowly accumulated layers. Thousands of pages. Countless hours. An enormous archive built around one central mystery. Then there was another challenge. The prosecution problem. Even if detectives discovered what happened, could they prove it? Courts demand evidence capable of surviving scrutiny. Defense attorneys challenge assumptions. Witness credibility becomes crucial. Every inconsistency matters. Without a body, the burden becomes even heavier. Prosecutors would eventually need to demonstrate not only that Jason was dead but also how he died and who was responsible. Achieving that goal seemed almost impossible. Many murder cases fail despite the existence of bodies, forensic evidence, and eyewitnesses. Jason's case lacked all three. Some legal observers privately questioned whether charges could ever be brought. The obstacles appeared overwhelming. Yet investigators continued working. Because despite every challenge, something refused to disappear. The consistency. Across years of interviews, changing witnesses, and evolving theories, certain core elements remained remarkably stable. Jason had been viewed as an informant. He had been lured to a meeting. He had disappeared immediately afterward. Multiple individuals appeared connected to the events surrounding that disappearance. The repetition of those themes kept the investigation alive. Detectives believed the truth existed. They simply needed someone willing to reveal it. As the first decade after Jason's disappearance drew toward its conclusion, subtle shifts began occurring. Nothing dramatic. Nothing headline-worthy. Just small changes. A witness becoming slightly more cooperative. A relationship deteriorating. A conversation remembered differently. Tiny cracks appearing in walls that had remained solid for years. Investigators noticed those cracks. They understood something fundamental about long-term conspiracies. No secret remains perfectly sealed forever. Human beings are imperfect. Eventually someone talks. Eventually someone regrets. Eventually someone decides they can no longer live with what they know. The challenge is being ready when that moment arrives. For nearly 14 years, detectives had been preparing for that moment. They had followed rumors through dead ends. Interviewed reluctant witnesses. Examined thousands of possibilities. Endured setbacks that would have ended many investigations. Now, without realizing it, they were approaching the breakthrough they had been chasing since 2001. The mystery was about to change. The silence was beginning to weaken. And somewhere within the growing mountain of evidence, The first real path toward justice was finally emerging. For nearly 14 years, the investigation into the disappearance and murder of Jason Martin Smith existed in a strange state of suspension. Detectives believed they were looking at a murder. They believed they understood the motive. They believed a group of individuals held the answers. Yet every attempt to transform those beliefs into a prosecutable case seemed to fail. The years accumulated. Witnesses aged. Evidence grew older. And still, no arrests were made. To outsiders, it may have appeared that the case was fading into history. Another unsolved mystery destined to remain buried forever. But beneath the surface, something important was happening. Time was changing people. The same force that weakened evidence was also weakening loyalty. The same years that made memories less reliable were making old allegiances less important. Relationships that once seemed unbreakable were beginning to crack. Friendships deteriorated. Criminal partnerships dissolved. Trust evaporated. The silence that had protected the truth for so long was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Experienced homicide investigators often describe a phenomenon that appears repeatedly in long-term cases. The secret itself becomes a burden. At first, participants feel confident. They believe they have succeeded. They believe nobody can prove what happened. But years have a way of changing that confidence. The memory never completely disappears. Certain dates become impossible to forget. Certain faces return unexpectedly in dreams. Every news article becomes a reminder. Every conversation about the past carries risk. People begin wondering who else knows. Who might talk? Who might already be cooperating? The conspiracy starts feeding on itself. Fear replaces confidence. Paranoia replaces certainty. And eventually someone makes a mistake. For investigators, the breakthrough rarely arrives as a dramatic confession. Real life is usually more complicated. Instead, breakthroughs emerge through a series of small developments that slowly begin aligning. A witness who once refused to cooperate becomes willing to speak. A previous statement gains new significance. A forgotten detail suddenly fits into a larger pattern. One piece leads to another. Then another. Then another. Until a picture emerges that was invisible before. That process appears to have played a critical role in the eventual resolution of Jason's case. As detectives continued reviewing evidence and re-examining witnesses, they began uncovering stronger support for theories that had existed for years. The difference was that now those theories were being reinforced from multiple directions. Independent accounts began aligning. Old statements gained credibility. Information once dismissed as rumor started appearing more reliable. The investigation was slowly moving from suspicion toward proof. One of the most significant developments involved witnesses whose accounts helped reconstruct the events surrounding Jason's disappearance. For years, detectives had heard fragments. Now they were beginning to hear a narrative. Not a perfect narrative. Not one without gaps. But a coherent account capable of explaining what had happened. The picture that emerged was horrifying. Jason had allegedly been targeted because he was believed to have informed on criminal associates following the Hampshire pawnshop robbery. That suspicion had transformed him into a liability. And according to the growing body of evidence, certain individuals had decided to deal with that perceived threat permanently. The investigation increasingly focused on specific suspects. Among the names that repeatedly surfaced was Mark Searle. For years, detectives had examined information connected to him and others believed to be involved. Now they were obtaining stronger evidence linking those individuals to the events of August 2001. The significance of this development cannot be overstated. After more than a decade of uncertainty, investigators finally believed they possessed enough information to move forward. Yet even then, the challenges remained enormous. This was still a nobody murder case. The victim had never been found. There was no grave. No recovered remains. No forensic examination of a body. Everything depended upon the strength of the overall evidence. Every witness mattered. Every statement mattered. Every corroborating detail mattered. Detectives knew that if they moved too soon and failed, they might never get another opportunity. The pressure was immense. Years of work had led to this moment. There could be no mistakes. The investigative team carefully assembled the case. Witness testimony was compared against other witness testimony. Timelines were reconstructed. Contradictions were analyzed. Every possible weakness was examined in advance. Prosecutors and investigators worked together to determine whether the available evidence could survive a trial. Their conclusion was clear. The time had finally come. In 2015, 14 years after Jason Martin Smith vanished, police took decisive action. Arrests were made. For the first time since the summer of 2001, the possibility of accountability became real. The significance of those arrests extended far beyond the individuals involved. For Jason's family and loved ones, they represented validation. For years they had lived with uncertainty. For years they had watched a case remain unresolved. Now investigators were publicly declaring what many had long suspected. Jason had not simply disappeared. He had been murdered. The arrests sent shockwaves through everyone connected to the case. Old memories resurfaced. Conversations that had occurred years earlier suddenly gained new significance. People who thought the investigation was over realized it had never truly ended. The detectives had simply been waiting. Waiting for enough evidence. Waiting for the right moment. Waiting for the silence to break. As preparations for prosecution intensified, the extraordinary nature of the case became increasingly apparent. Most murder prosecutions begin with a body. This one did not. Most murder prosecutions involve forensic examinations establishing cause of death. This one could not. Most murder prosecutions rely heavily on physical evidence recovered from a crime scene. This case would depend primarily upon witness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and the cumulative strength of years of investigation. That reality created enormous legal challenges. The defense would inevitably point to the absence of a body. The defense would inevitably attack witness credibility. The defense would inevitably argue that the prosecution was attempting to prove murder without definitive physical proof. Investigators understood those arguments long before they were presented in court. Their task was not merely to show that Jason disappeared. Their task was to demonstrate that every reasonable explanation other than murder had become impossible. To accomplish that goal, prosecutors needed to tell a story. Not a fictional story. A factual reconstruction supported by evidence. A story explaining motive, opportunity, actions, consequences. And as the case moved closer to trial, that story became increasingly compelling. Jason had been accused of informing. Individuals associated with him believed he posed a threat. He had been lured to a meeting. Witnesses described his abduction. Witnesses connected suspects to a garage where evidence of violence was allegedly observed. Jason was never seen again. Years later, multiple strands of testimony pointed toward murder. Individually, each element could perhaps be challenged. Together, they formed a powerful narrative. The breakthrough was not a single piece of evidence. It was the convergence of evidence. 1,000 fragments finally becoming one picture. That is often how cold cases are solved. Not through miracles. Not through dramatic revelations. But through persistence. Through investigators refusing to quit. Through witnesses eventually speaking. Through the gradual accumulation of truth. For detectives who had spent years on the case, the breakthrough represented more than professional success. It represented vindication. There had been moments when the investigation appeared hopeless. Moments when critics questioned whether the case would ever reach court. Moments when the absence of a body seemed insurmountable. Yet they had continued working. Now the results of that persistence were becoming visible. The significance extended beyond Hastings. Law enforcement agencies across Britain watched the case closely. No-body murder prosecutions remain among the most difficult legal undertakings in criminal justice. A successful prosecution would demonstrate that murderers could not rely solely on the disappearance of remains. It would send a powerful message. Destroying a body does not destroy the truth. As the court proceedings approached, anticipation grew. The public learned new details. The media revisited the story. Questions that had lingered for 14 years suddenly demanded answers. What exactly happened inside that garage? Who participated? How much had different individuals known? And perhaps most hauntingly, where was Jason Martin Smith? That final question remained unresolved. Despite the arrests. Despite the evidence. Despite years of investigation. The victim's body had never been recovered. That absence remained a painful reminder of how much was still unknown. Yet investigators had reached an important conclusion. Justice does not always require complete answers. Sometimes enough truth survives. Sometimes enough evidence remains. Sometimes the collective weight of testimony, circumstances, and human memory becomes stronger than the silence intended to bury it. That realization formed the foundation of the prosecution's case. The breakthrough had finally arrived. After 14 years of frustration, dead ends, rumors, fear, and uncertainty, detectives believed they could finally present the truth before a jury. The next stage would determine whether that truth was enough. The investigation had carried the case this far. Now the courtroom would decide the rest. And for the first time since August of 2001, the people accused of destroying Jason Martin Smith's life would be forced to confront the possibility that the secret they had hidden for so long was about to be exposed in full view of the world. A courtroom is often described as a place where truth is revealed, but in reality it is something more fragile than that. It is a place where competing versions of truth are tested. Where memory is challenged. Where evidence is weighed against doubt. Where silence is forced to speak through witnesses who have carried it for years. When the trial of those accused in the disappearance and murder of Jason Martin Smith finally began, it carried the weight of 14 years of unanswered questions. The absence of a body loomed over everything. It was the first thing the defense would rely on. And the first obstacle the prosecution had to overcome. Because in most murder trials, the victim is present in absence but confirmed through physical remains. In this case, Jason existed only through testimony, records, and the memories of those willing to speak. The prosecution's challenge was extraordinary. They had to prove not only that Jason was dead, but that he had been deliberately killed, and that specific individuals were responsible. The defense strategy was predictable but powerful. They emphasized uncertainty. They highlighted inconsistencies in witness accounts. They pointed to the lack of physical remains. They suggested that assumptions had replaced evidence. And they reminded the jury of a fundamental legal principle: suspicion is not proof. Inside the courtroom, time felt compressed. Events from 2001 were reconstructed in careful detail. Witnesses described fragments of conversations. Old fears resurfaced in testimony. Statements made years earlier were revisited and compared against new accounts. The atmosphere was tense, not because of dramatic outbursts, but because of what was absent. No body. No definitive forensic reconstruction. Only human memory trying to reach across a decade and a half. The prosecution built its case carefully. They presented a narrative that linked Jason's disappearance to suspicions within criminal circles that he had acted as an informant. They outlined how that belief had allegedly transformed him into a target. They described the arrangements that led him to be lured to a meeting on the evening of August 21, 2001. They walked the jury through the sequence of events that followed. The confrontation. The abduction. The transportation to a secondary location. The violence that allegedly occurred inside or near a garage. Witness testimony referenced the presence of blood. Tools that suggested brutality. Behavior that indicated panic and concealment afterward. Each piece of evidence alone was not decisive. But together, they formed a pattern the prosecution argued could not be explained away by coincidence. One of the most important elements of the trial was the testimony of individuals connected to the criminal environment in which Jason moved. These witnesses described fear that had persisted for years. Fear of speaking. Fear of consequences. Fear that silence was the only form of protection available to them. When they finally spoke in court, their words carried the weight of long-delayed disclosure. The defense worked aggressively to undermine their credibility. They questioned motives. They pointed to inconsistencies. They suggested that time had distorted memory. And in some cases, they were right to raise those concerns. But the prosecution countered with something equally important. Consistency across multiple accounts. Independent statements that aligned in key details despite being given at different times. It was this convergence that became critical. Not a single witness, but multiple witnesses describing a similar sequence of events. The garage remained a focal point throughout the proceedings. It represented the physical anchor of the prosecution's theory. A place where key events were believed to have occurred. Although years had passed, and forensic evidence had deteriorated or disappeared, testimony regarding that location remained central. The jury was asked to consider whether it was possible that so many separate accounts could be coincidentally incorrect in the same way. As the trial progressed, attention turned to the accused individuals. Among them, Mark Searle was identified as a central figure in the prosecution's case. The argument presented was that he had played a direct role in Jason's murder. Other defendants faced charges connected to conspiracy and involvement in the events surrounding the abduction. Each defendant had their own defense strategy. Some denied involvement entirely. Some acknowledged presence in certain situations but denied participation in violence. Others challenged the reliability of the entire investigation. The courtroom became a space where competing narratives collided. One side describing a coordinated act of murder. The other insisting on uncertainty and unreliable recollections. What made the case particularly difficult for jurors was the absence of physical confirmation. There was no body to examine. No autopsy report to reference. No definitive cause of death recorded in a medical sense. Instead, the jury had to rely on reconstructed events. On testimony. On inference. On the collective weight of circumstantial evidence. Throughout the trial, Jason remained an unseen presence. Every witness spoke about him in the past tense. Every account referred to his disappearance as a completed act. And yet, without physical remains, his absence felt paradoxically both real and abstract. The prosecution addressed this directly. They argued that the absence of a body did not mean the absence of murder. They suggested that the very lack of remains was consistent with the methods described by witnesses. Deliberate concealment. Efforts to prevent recovery. Actions intended to erase evidence of the crime. The jury was asked to consider whether it was reasonable to conclude that Jason could have simply vanished without explanation while surrounded by evidence pointing toward violence. The defense maintained that such conclusions were dangerous. They warned against allowing suspicion to replace certainty. They emphasized that criminal convictions must be based on proof beyond reasonable doubt. Not belief. Not probability. Proof. As the trial continued, the emotional weight of the case became increasingly visible. For Jason's family, every day in court represented a painful return to events they had lived with for years. For investigators, it represented the culmination of a 14-year effort. For the jury, it represented a responsibility that carried immense seriousness. They were not only deciding guilt or innocence. They were determining whether a man who had disappeared without a trace had in fact been murdered. One of the most significant aspects of the prosecution's argument was the cumulative nature of the evidence. No single witness statement was presented as definitive proof. Instead, the prosecution urged the jury to consider the totality of the evidence. The convergence of motive, opportunity, behavior, and post-event actions. The alleged disappearance of Jason immediately after being lured to a meeting. The accounts of violence linked to a garage. The disappearance of his body. The alleged attempts to conceal what had happened. Each element reinforced the others. The defense attempted to separate these strands, to isolate each piece of evidence and challenge it individually. But the prosecution's strategy depended on connection rather than isolation. As closing arguments approached, the tension in the courtroom intensified. Years of investigation had led to this moment. The final presentation of competing interpretations of the same events. When the jury retired to consider their verdict, the atmosphere was heavy with uncertainty. There was no way to predict how they would interpret evidence that relied so heavily on inference and testimony. Days passed. Then more time. Finally, the verdict was delivered. The jury found Mark Searle guilty of the murder of Jason Martin Smith. Other defendants were also convicted on related charges, including conspiracy and involvement in the abduction. The courtroom reaction was restrained but deeply emotional. For the prosecution team, it represented the conclusion of a long and complex investigation. For Jason's family, it represented acknowledgement of a truth they had long believed but could never prove. For the defense, it marked the end of a legal battle that had tested the limits of no-body murder prosecution. Yet even with the verdict delivered, one crucial element remained unresolved. Jason Martin Smith's body had never been found. The conviction established legal certainty. But it did not provide physical closure. There was still no grave. No final resting place. No location where loved ones could say goodbye. In that sense, the case remained incomplete. Justice had been achieved in a courtroom, but not fully in the world outside it. The verdict demonstrated that even without a body, a murder could be proven beyond reasonable doubt. It showed that silence, no matter how long it endured, could eventually be broken by accumulated evidence and testimony. It also revealed something more unsettling. That some crimes are so carefully concealed that even justice arrives without ever fully restoring what was lost. Jason Martin Smith remained missing, but no longer forgotten. And although his final resting place remained unknown, the truth of what happened to him had finally been acknowledged in a court of law after 14 years of silence. Even after a verdict is delivered, some cases refuse to feel finished. Courtrooms can declare guilt or innocence, but they cannot always restore what has been taken. They cannot return time. They cannot erase fear. And they cannot bring back a body that was never recovered. For Jason Martin Smith's family, the end of the trial did not function like an ending in the traditional sense. There was no return to normal life. No moment where everything suddenly felt resolved. Instead, there was a quieter, more complicated reality. The truth had been acknowledged in a courtroom, but the absence remained unchanged. Jason was still gone. Still missing in the most literal sense. Still without a resting place where grief could finally settle. That absence shaped everything that followed. Because closure is not only about knowing what happened. It is also about what cannot be recovered afterward. The verdict confirmed what investigators had believed for years. That Jason had been murdered. That his disappearance was not voluntary. That multiple individuals had been involved in a coordinated act of violence and concealment. Legally, the case had reached resolution. Emotionally, it had not. In many ways, the aftermath of a case like this begins where the courtroom ends. Outside the structure of legal procedure, families are left to reconstruct meaning from fragments. A conviction does not erase unanswered questions. It does not fill the silence left behind by a missing person. It only defines responsibility. And even responsibility can feel abstract when there is no physical presence of the victim. For investigators, the conclusion of the trial marked both success and reflection. Success because a complex and long-stalled case had finally resulted in convictions. Reflection because of the extraordinary challenges that had defined the investigation. A case without a body had required patience that spanned more than a decade. It had required reliance on witness memory, circumstantial patterns, and the gradual erosion of silence over time. It demonstrated how fragile long-term secrecy can become. What appears unbreakable in the early years of a cover-up can slowly weaken under the weight of time, human conscience, and changing relationships. People who once refused to speak eventually reconsider their silence. Not always because they want to. Sometimes because they can no longer carry what they know. Sometimes because fear loses its power. Sometimes because the past becomes impossible to live with. The Hastings case became an example often discussed in investigative circles for this reason. It showed that even when physical evidence is missing, patterns of behavior and converging testimony can still form a prosecutable narrative. It also highlighted the limits of concealment. A body can be hidden. Evidence can be disturbed. Witnesses can be intimidated. But complete erasure is far more difficult than it appears. Human memory persists. Relationships shift. Truth has a way of resurfacing, even slowly. For those convicted, the legal consequences were severe, but the broader implications extended beyond sentencing. The case became a warning within criminal environments that silence is not permanent protection. That belief in complete impunity can eventually collapse. That time, rather than protecting secrets, can contribute to their exposure. But for the public, the most haunting element of the case remained unchanged. Jason Martin Smith was still never found. That single fact continued to overshadow everything else. Without a body, the imagination fills the gaps. People picture different versions of what might have happened. They imagine final moments. They imagine locations that may never be identified. They imagine conversations that will never be heard. In that sense, missing victims remain suspended between two worlds. Legally recognized as deceased. Physically absent from the world of the living. But never fully integrated into the closure that normally follows death. The passage of time does not soften that absence. If anything, it sometimes deepens it. Years later, people still revisit cases like Jason's not because they are unresolved in a legal sense, but because they remain unresolved in a human sense. The mind resists incomplete stories. It searches for missing pieces. It returns again and again to the same unanswered question. Where is he? That question carries a weight that even convictions cannot fully relieve. It is the difference between justice and resolution. Justice was achieved in court. Resolution, for the family, remains elusive. There is also the broader reflection on how communities process violence that occurs beneath the surface of everyday life. Hastings, like many towns, continued to exist during and after the investigation. People went to work. Children grew up. Seasons changed. The coastline remained the same. Yet beneath that normality, something irreversible had occurred. A man had vanished. A crime had taken place. And a hidden world of fear, loyalty, and violence had briefly surfaced into public view. Cases like this remind communities that serious crime is not always distant or visible. Sometimes it exists within familiar environments. Among familiar faces. Within networks that appear ordinary until they are examined closely. The aftermath of the case also revealed the long shadow cast by suspicion. Even after convictions, questions about the full extent of involvement, knowledge, and silence often remain. Not everyone who knows speaks. Not everyone who speaks knows everything. And not every answer satisfies every question. That complexity is part of what makes real criminal investigations so different from fictional ones. There is rarely a perfect ending. Only degrees of understanding. For the investigators who worked on the case, there is also the personal legacy. Long investigations leave lasting impressions. They shape careers. They define professional identities. Some cases are remembered not just for their outcome but for the persistence required to reach it. Jason Martin Smith's case became one of those investigations. A reminder that time does not necessarily erase truth. It only changes how difficult it is to uncover. In reflecting on the entire timeline of events, from the summer of 2001 to the courtroom verdict 14 years later, one pattern stands out. Silence was never permanent. At first, silence protected those involved. It delayed justice. It obscured facts. It created uncertainty. But over time, silence began to fracture. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But gradually, through small cracks that eventually widened into openings investigators could work with. That process is one of the most important lessons from the case. Truth in long-term investigations rarely arrives suddenly. It accumulates. It builds. It waits. And when it finally emerges, it does so because enough pieces have aligned to make denial impossible. For Jason's family, however, that philosophical conclusion does little to ease the emotional reality. A conviction acknowledges what happened. It does not replace what was lost. It does not bring back presence. It does not restore the ordinary experience of life before disappearance. There is still the absence of a grave. Still the absence of a place to visit. Still the absence of physical certainty. That is the part of the case that remains unresolved in the most human sense. As time continues to pass, cases like this gradually become part of collective memory. They are referenced in discussions about criminal investigation, legal precedent, and the challenges of no-body prosecutions. But for those directly affected, they are not historical examples. They are lived experiences that do not end when headlines fade. They continue quietly, every day, in the absence that remains. The story of Jason Martin Smith is ultimately not only about murder or investigation or conviction. It is about how fragile human trust can be. How quickly suspicion can transform into violence. How long silence can endure before it breaks. And how even after truth is established, absence can remain unchanged. In the end, what remains is a contrast that defines the entire case. A man disappeared. A truth was hidden. A crime was eventually proven. But one question remains unanswered above all others. Where is Jason Martin Smith? And until that question is answered, the story will never fully close. Because some cases are not just about what happened. They are about what is still missing. Some cases end with a verdict. Some end with closure. And some end in a way that forces everyone involved to accept that resolution and absence are not the same thing. The case of Jason Martin Smith belongs firmly in the last category. Legally, the matter was resolved. A court heard the evidence, weighed the testimony, and reached a conclusion that his death was not only likely but the result of deliberate violence carried out by multiple individuals. Convictions were secured. Responsibility was assigned. The machinery of justice completed its task in the only way it could, given the limitations of the evidence available. But justice in a courtroom does not always translate into emotional resolution in the real world. Outside the courtroom, the reality remained unchanged. Jason Martin Smith was still missing. No grave marked his name. No physical remains were returned to his family. No final moment of goodbye was ever possible. That absence continues to define the case more than any verdict ever could. Time moves forward for everyone except memory. For investigators, the case gradually becomes part of professional history, a reference point in training discussions about no-body murder prosecutions and the importance of persistence in long-term investigations. It is studied as an example of how circumstantial evidence, when strong enough and consistent enough, can replace what is physically missing. It is also remembered as a reminder that some crimes are designed not only to kill, but to erase. For the families involved, time does something very different. It does not turn the page. It only adds layers to what is already unresolved. There is no moment when the absence becomes easier to accept, only moments when it becomes more familiar. Birthdays pass without acknowledgement. Seasons change without significance. Ordinary days continue to arrive, each carrying the same quiet absence in the background. For the community where the events unfolded, the case slowly becomes part of local history. People who were not yet old enough to remember the original disappearance later learn about it in fragments, through conversations, articles, or brief mentions. Over time, the story becomes something spoken about in past tense, but never fully detached from the place where it happened. It remains part of the town's hidden memory, a reminder that even ordinary environments can hold extraordinary darkness beneath their surface. For those who followed the investigation closely, one of the most striking elements remains the same. The silence did not hold forever. For years it appeared unbreakable, reinforced by fear, loyalty, and distance. Yet over time, that silence fractured. Not through a single revelation, but through accumulation. Small inconsistencies, shifting relationships, gradual willingness to speak. Pieces of information that, when finally combined, created a picture strong enough to stand in court. That is one of the quiet truths of long investigations. The turning point rarely arrives as a dramatic moment. It arrives as a slow convergence of pressure, time, and human imperfection. People forget what they once agreed to keep hidden. Fear weakens. Distance grows. And what was once sealed begins to open, not all at once, but enough to allow truth to emerge. In Jason Martin Smith's case, that process took 14 years. 14 years of uncertainty. 14 years of unanswered questions. 14 years in which his name existed between memory and mystery, between investigation and absence. Even now, years after the convictions, one question remains untouched by time or verdict. It is not a legal question. It is not a procedural one. It is something far simpler and far more difficult. Where is he? That question continues to sit at the center of the case because it represents the one element no courtroom can resolve. Without a recovery, without a burial site, without physical closure, the story remains suspended. The legal truth is known, but the human truth is incomplete. And perhaps that is the final reflection this case leaves behind. That justice, while essential, is not always final in the way people imagine it to be. It can hold people accountable. It can establish truth. It can acknowledge harm. But it cannot always restore what has been taken, and it cannot always answer every question left in the wake of violence. Jason Martin Smith's story ends in that space between certainty and absence. A case proven but not physically resolved. A life acknowledged but not returned to rest. A truth established, but a location still unknown. In the end, what remains is not only the memory of what happened, but the silence that continues afterward. A silence that no verdict can fully replace, and no passage of time can fully erase. And as long as that silence remains, the story of Jason Martin Smith remains unfinished in the only way that still matters.